The telegraph office at Timberline had grown to dread the sight of Micah Fenwick's hat in the doorway, because it meant, once again, the same question asked in the same low, careful voice. Any word on the overland? Nothing new, Mr. Fenwick, the clerk said for the sixth straight morning, not quite meeting his eyes. Line still down past Ash Fork. Snow's got the whole grade buried under 6 feet, they're saying. Could be tomorrow, could be another week. Micah had been telling himself tomorrow for 6 days already, ever since the letter had come announcing that Miss Josephine Calloway of St. Louis would arrive on the Tuesday train, and he had driven the wagon into town Tuesday morning with a bouquet of dried winter berries wrapped in brown paper, and a heart hammering harder than it had any business hammering over a woman he had never once laid eyes on. Tuesday had come and gone with no train at all, only a wire saying the overland was snowbound somewhere past the divide, passengers safe but stranded, further word to follow. Wednesday had brought the same. So had Thursday and Friday, until the dried berries had gone brittle in their paper and Micah had stopped bringing them at all, and stopped, some cold mornings, quite believing she was coming. He had her letters, though, and those he read again each night by lamplight until the creases in the paper had gone soft as cloth. You asked what sort of woman would answer a rancher's notice for a wife she'd never met. She had written in her third letter, the one he liked best. I am the sort who has spent 6 years teaching other people's unruly children their letters, and has grown entirely tired of belonging to no one in particular. If you are half so patient as your letters suggest, Mr. Fenwick, I believe I could learn to belong to Timberline instead. He had read that line so many times he could have recited it in his sleep, and some nights, lying awake listening to the wind claw at the ranch house eaves, he did. She had answered his notice on a whim, or so she had told her landlady at the time, though the truth was less simple than a whim. 6 years of teaching other women's children their letters and sums in a St. Louis schoolroom had left her competent, respected, and entirely alone, invited to every christening and wedding in the parish, and never once the center of one. When the notice from a Timberline rancher had come round through her cousin's church circular, a widower's brother, in fact, seeking a wife by honest correspondence, no fortune promised but a fair and steady life, she had almost thrown it in the grate along with the others. It was his second letter that stopped her. 3 plain paragraphs about the ranch, the mountains, the particular blue of the sky before a storm, written by a man who clearly loved his land and did not know how to dress that love up in anything but the truth. She had written back that very night, and had not stopped in the 4 months since, wondering what it would be to be looked at the way he seemed to look at his mountains. Josephine, 600 miles east and 3 cars back from the stalled engine, had stopped believing in Tuesday around the same hour Micah had. The overland sat buried to its windows in a drift the conductor called the worst he'd seen in 11 years running this line, wedged fast between 2 rock cuts where the wind had nowhere to go but straight down the grade, packing snow tighter with every passing hour. The passenger cars had gone cold on the second day, when the coal ran short and had to be rationed between the engine and the stoves, and by the 4th day the water in the tin cups froze solid overnight, and the children in the rear car had stopped crying from boredom and started crying from something closer to fear. "They'll dig us out," she told the frightened boy across the aisle, a farmer's son traveling alone to kin in the territory, more times than she could count, though by the 5th day she was no longer entirely certain she believed it herself. She thought of Micah's letters to keep her own courage up, steady, plain, unhurried letters from a man who had written, in his very first, "I don't need a wife who can recite poetry, Miss Calloway, only one who won't run from hard winters, because we get them here, and I intend to be the kind of husband who doesn't run from them either." She had liked that line enough to answer his notice at all, tired as she was of a life spent minding other women's children and none of her own, and now, snowbound and shivering 600 miles from the ranch he'd described in careful, homesick detail, she found herself hoping fiercely that a man who wrote like that would not simply give up on a woman the weather had stolen from him. By the 6th night, With the coal nearly gone and the cold pressing in through every seam of the car, the conductor came through with a lantern, and a grim face to say a relief crew was fighting toward them from the timberline side. A dozen men with shovels and mules, but the drifts between here and there stood taller than a horse, and the going was slow enough that no one dared promise when, or if, they'd break through before the last of the coal burned out entirely. Micah had been one of the first to volunteer when the wire finally came through calling for able hands, and he'd spent that whole brutal night driving a shovel into snow packed hard as stone, alongside 10 other men from town who worked in relays because no single body could stand the cold and the labor both for more than an hour at a stretch. The wind came down off the ridge like something with a grudge, and twice a man had to be hauled back from the cut half frozen and sent to warm by the fire wagon before he lost fingers to it. And still Micah dug, thinking of a woman he had never met freezing 3 miles up that buried grade because of a letter she had answered and a promise he had made her. "You'll kill yourself out here for a stranger," old Ezra Cobb told him around midnight, passing him a flask he refused. "She isn't a stranger." Micah drove the shovel in again, arms burning, breath coming ragged and white. "I've read that woman's letters 100 times, Ezra. I know her better than I've known most folks I've lived beside my whole life. She is not going to freeze to death 6 miles from her own wedding while I sit warm by a fire wondering if I ought to have tried harder." Somewhere near 2 in the morning, with his shoulders screaming and the lantern light gone thin and gray, Micah nearly did stop. He straightened, gasping, and looked up the buried grade toward a train he could not see and a woman he had never touched, and thought treacherously that a man could tell himself he had done enough, that no one would fault him for warming his hands by the fire wagon a while and letting a fresher back take the shovel. It was Ezra, of all people, who caught the look on his face and shoved the flask at him a second time, not for drinking but for something to hold on to. "You've come this far talking about her like she's already your wife," Ezra said, not unkindly. "Seems a poor time to start doubting it." Micah looked at the flask, and past it at the black wall of snow still standing between him and the overland, and thought of her third letter, the one about belonging to no one in particular, and found the doubt could not survive next to it. He handed the flask back untouched and drove his shovel in again, and did not stop, this time, until the gray light of dawn showed him the trapped engine's black smokestack rising just beyond the last drift, close enough now to shout to. They broke through an hour before dawn, the relief crew's shovels finally meeting the trapped engine's own desperate digging from the other side, and Micah was among the first to scramble over the last wall of packed snow and haul open the frozen door of the rearmost passenger car, lantern swinging, calling a name he had only ever written and never once spoken aloud. "Miss Calloway, Josephine Calloway." She rose from where she'd been huddled under every coat the car could spare, wrapped around the shivering farmer's boy to share what warmth she had left, her lips gone faintly blue, her hair come loose from its pins, and looked at the broad-shouldered, frost-bearded stranger filling the doorway with a lantern held high, and knew him instantly, impossibly, the way a person knows a voice they have only ever heard on paper. "Mr. Fenwick," her own voice cracked, half laugh, half something closer to tears. "You came. I told you I don't run from hard winters." He crossed the car in 3 strides and got an arm around her before her knees, weak with cold and 6 days of fear held rigidly in check, could give out entirely. "Though I'll admit, ma'am, this is a harder one than I'd planned for our first meeting." "I brought no poetry," she managed, teeth chattering, clinging to his coat sleeve as he half carried her toward the door and the waiting sleigh beyond. "Only a great deal of frozen luggage and a farmer's boy I refuse to leave behind." "Then we'll take the boy too, and worry about poetry later." He got her wrapped in his own coat before she could protest, and lifted the shivering child up after her without a second's hesitation, and Josephine, watching him do it with the same unhurried steadiness that had filled every letter he'd ever sent her, felt something in her chest that 6 days of cold and fear had nearly frozen shut come suddenly, achingly alive. The ride back to Timberline took the better part of the morning, the sleigh runners hissing over drifts still deep enough to bury a wagon wheel, and Micah kept one arm around her the whole way, sharing warmth and, when she asked for it, sharing the very words from his letters that she had memorized without ever telling him so. "You wrote once that you intended to be the kind of husband who doesn't run from hard winters," she said, her voice steadier now, color creeping back into her cheeks under the weight of his coat and his arm both. "I didn't understand, reading it in St. Louis, what that would actually cost a man, digging half the night in a storm like that one." "It cost considerably less than losing you to it would have," he said simply. "I waited 6 days at that depot telling myself tomorrow, tomorrow, until I nearly stopped believing my own tomorrow. I'm not inclined to lose you to one more, ma'am, not after coming this far to keep you." She looked at him, this patient, plain-spoken rancher who had dug through a night of killing cold on the strength of letters alone, who had chosen a stranger's safety over his own and called it nothing worth mentioning, and found she believed entirely that she had answered the right notice after all. They were married 8 days later in the small Timberline church, once the roads had cleared enough for a proper wedding and Josephine had thawed, by her own account, all the way through. She wore a dress hastily let out by the dressmaker in town, and carried, at Micah's insistence, a small bouquet of dried winter berries he had finally, after 9 days of carrying them folded in brown paper through every kind of weather, gotten the chance to give her. The farmer's boy she had refused to leave behind on the mountain stood near the front pew with his kin from the territory, scrubbed clean and grinning, and when the vows were spoken, he was the first to whoop loud enough to make the whole small congregation laugh. Josephine caught his eye across the church and smiled, thinking that whatever else that terrible week in the snow had cost her, it had also taught her something about the kind of man she was marrying, the kind who counted a stranger's child worth saving in the same breath as his own bride, and never once thought to mention it as a virtue. "I nearly gave up on Tuesday," he admitted at the small gathering after, holding her hand before the whole assembled town of well-wishers. "And Wednesday, and every day after, until the wire came that finally sent me up that mountain." "But you never truly gave up," Josephine said, smiling up at him with the particular warmth of a woman who has been frozen through and brought entirely back to life. "Not once, in 6 days or in 6 feet of snow." "No," he agreed, drawing her close in the golden hush of the little church, snow still glittering on the pines beyond the window glass. "And I intend to spend every winter after this one proving to you it was worth every frozen day I waited."